A black sky boiled above the prairie, swollen with storm clouds that split open in jagged streaks of lightning. Rain fell in sheets, drumming against rooftops and splattering into the dirt streets of a frontier town already half-rotted by greed. The wind pushed hard against the warped boards of a barn at the edge of town, where lanterns flickered in defiance of the storm. Smoke from oil lamps mixed with the bitter reek of whiskey, damp hay, and men crowded too close together. Voices rose above the thunder, hoarse, cruel voices filled with laughter and bidding. At the center of it all stood a young woman with wrists bound in coarse rope. Clara held her chin high, though her face was streaked with rain and shadow. She was tall, broad-shouldered, built with strength the frontier valued in oxen and mules but scorned in women. The auctioneer, a man with slick hair and a mouth too eager to sneer, paced in front of her like a showman. "Too big for the fancy folk," he barked, slapping the air with his hat, "but strong as an ox. She'll drag a plow, lift a wagon, and still have strength left to cook. Who'll start the bidding? Don't be shy now. Ain't every day you get this much muscle for so little." The crowd jeered. A rancher at the back shouted she'd break a wagon before she broke a sweat. The others roared with laughter. Clara did not lower her gaze. Her eyes burned, humiliation laced with a defiance that silenced one or two of the men when they caught it. But most just spat, shuffled, and raised their hands with mocking bids. The auctioneer's gavel struck wood. "Come now, gentlemen, don't all speak at once." His voice cracked with forced cheer, as though the storm outside might drown him out if he faltered. The barn door banged open then, caught by the wind. All heads turned. A man stepped inside, tall, lean, wearing a long duster dripping with rain. His hat shadowed his face until lightning flared through the cracks of the barn wall. A scar cut across his jaw, and his eyes were the color of iron cooled in ashes. He did not hurry. His boots thudded against the warped planks as he walked forward, the sound steady, unbroken by the storm. "Elias Vance," someone muttered, and a ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Elias stood still at the edge of the circle, arms folded, gaze fixed on Clara. He said nothing. The bidding grew louder, more vicious, each number thrown like a stone. The auctioneer's smile grew desperate, his eyes darting toward Elias as though hoping he'd speak. Another rancher raised his voice crueler than the rest. "Why don't we weigh her instead of countin' dollars? Be easier that way." The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly. Clara flinched for the first time, her lips tightening. The gavel slammed again, echoing like a gunshot. The auctioneer opened his mouth to declare the sale, but Elias moved. One step forward, boots striking hard. His voice cut through the din, cold and sure. "She's just right for my arms." The barn went silent. Gasps, mutters, the shuffle of boots against straw. Clara's head turned, her eyes narrowing at him. The auctioneer blinked, then forced a laugh. "Well now, at last a man knows value when he sees it." The gavel came down, hard enough to rattle the table. "Sold!" Elias walked straight to Clara, ignoring the murmurs, the sour stares. He pulled a knife from his belt and cut the rope at her wrists. She rubbed her raw skin but did not thank him, did not trust him. He leaned close, lips barely moving, and whispered something only she could hear. Her eyes widened, confusion and suspicion tangling in their depths. Lightning flared again, bright enough to turn every face pale for an instant. The storm roared, rain hammering harder against the roof. Clara stood free but frozen, staring at Elias with fear and disbelief, her chest heaving. Who was this man and why had he chosen her? Rain swallowed the town the moment they left the barn. The storm had grown angrier, pelting the ground so hard it seemed the prairie itself might wash away. Elias swung up into the saddle and reached a hand down. Clara hesitated, her wrists raw and red from the rope, but the shouts of men inside reminded her she had no choice. She gripped his hand, pulled herself up behind him, and they rode out into the night. The horses' hooves pounded against the soaked earth, each strike dull and heavy, muffled by mud. Lightning cracked above, revealing the endless stretch of prairie. Grass flattened by the storm, creeks swollen and spilling over. The world smelled of wet leather, iron, and fear. Clara's grip on the saddle was steady, but her body was tense, each breath controlled, measured, refusing to show weakness. They rode in silence, the storm filling every gap between them. For a long time she said nothing. Then her voice cut through the rain, sharp and steady. "Why'd you buy me?" Elias didn't answer right away. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the horizon. The rain slid off the brim of his hat, dripping down his coat. He let the silence stretch almost as if weighing whether she deserved the truth or another lie. Finally, his voice came low and clipped. Because I know what they'd do, and I couldn't let it happen. Clara studied the back of his head, trying to read the man through the shape of his shoulders. His answer wasn't kind. It wasn't tender. It was fact, spoken as if saving her was just a matter of calculation, not heart. She let the words hang between them, heavy as the clouds overhead. Elias reached inside his duster, pulled free a folded wool blanket, and offered it back to her. She glanced at it, then at him. For a moment, something in her eyes wavered, a flicker of need. But she pressed her lips together and turned her face to the rain. Keep it. He gave the faintest nod, tucked it back, and spurred the horse faster. The storm seemed endless, the land stretching black and empty in every direction. Yet as Elias rode, his thoughts were far from empty. The girl's voice had struck something deep. Years ago, in another town, another storm, he had stood powerless while land barons took his wife. She had been kind, fierce, stubborn as the wind itself. They called her property, a ledger entry, something to be bargained away. And he had done nothing. He could still see her face that night when they dragged her into the wagon, eyes searching his, waiting for him to act. But he hadn't. By the time he found the courage, it was too late. Her grave lay on a ridge outside Santa Fe, marked only by a crooked wooden cross. At that grave, he had made a vow. Never again would he stand by while someone was treated like less than human. The promise burned in his chest now, each hoofbeat hammering it deeper. Clara was not his wife, but her defiance was the same, her strength the same. Saving her wasn't kindness. It was redemption, a debt to the dead he could never repay. The rain eased just enough for him to lift his head, scanning the prairie. That's when he saw them. On the far ridge where the land rose like the spine of some buried beast, torchlights flickered in the darkness. 1, 2, then 5, riders, their shapes distorted by distance and storm, moving steady and sure. Elias's stomach clenched. Those were no wanderers. Those were the men who had lost the bid. They weren't about to let a cowboy steal what they believed was theirs. He tightened his grip on the reins. Hold on, he muttered. Clara leaned forward, her voice cold as steel. Who's following us? Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. The torches burned brighter against the storm, and the riders began to descend. Thunder rolled like barrels down a canyon as Elias yanked the reins and cut left toward the black bones of an old mission that rose from the prairie like a broken tooth. The horse slipped in mud, caught itself, and lunged forward. Wind howled through the ruined bell tower, turning the iron tongue into a loose, clacking thing. Elias slid from the saddle, hauled Clara down, and they ran bent low, boots splashing through puddles as rain hammered the sagging roof. Inside, darkness breathed. The wooden beams groaned under the storm's shove, and shattered panes spat cold needles of rain onto pews furred with dust. A torn altar cloth hung like a wound. The smell of wet rot and old smoke mixed with the copper tang of fear. Elias shoved a pew against the main doors, then another, shoulders burning. He listened. Hoofbeats spread out across the yard, circling, testing. Torches hissed in the rain, their light flickering through the high windows, printing restless bands of orange on the cracked plaster saints. Clara's breath steadied, deliberate. She took in the room with a fighter's eyes, the fallen cross, the broken hymnals, the warped plank that could be a club. She picked up the plank, hefted the weight in her hands. Her wrists were still raw. She didn't flinch. You risked your life for me, she whispered, voice just above the storm's teeth. Why? Elias didn't answer at once. He ran his thumb across the cylinder of his revolver, counted the dull brass mouths looking back at him. 5. He spun it once, made sure it clicked clean, then slid the gun into his palm. The memory that clawed up his throat he swallowed back down. Not now. Before he could speak, a shot cracked outside. A shutter exploded into splinters, wood chipping his ear. Dust rained from the rafters in a thin, choking veil. He shoved Clara behind a pillar as another shot punched through the wall and buried itself in the altar, leaving a neat, smoking hole. She don't belong to you, Vance, a voice bellowed from the dark. Another answered with a meaner drawl, thick with whiskey and pride. She was bought cheap. Hand her over and we'll let you walk out. Elias stepped to the edge of the window frame and fired once, low, not to hit but to make them duck. The flash lit his jaw, the scar bright for a heartbeat. Walk on, he called, flat and hard. Night's long and I got no patience. Laughter drifted back, ugly and sure. Prowling shapes shifted in the torchlight. Someone rattled the side door and the rusted latch chattered like teeth. He looked at Clara, then really looked, past rain and mud and rope burns. She had a plank in her hands and something fierce in her eyes, the kind of fire that didn't come from anger alone, but from the long years that make anger a craft. He held her gaze. "You ready to fight?" he asked. "Or do you want me to hide you?" Her answer came like flint striking steel. "I've been hidden long enough." He nodded once. "Then it's you and me." He moved fast, dragging another pew toward the side door, wedging it under the iron handle. He grabbed a cracked salter, shoved it beneath a wobbling beam to brace the main barricade. The storm shoved back. The church shivered. On the altar, a leather-bound Bible lay fat with damp. A pressed flower fell from between its pages when Clara brushed it, pale ghost of some other spring. She tucked the bloom into her sleeve without thinking, a little talisman against the night. The gesture was small. It steadied her hands. A torch flared against the stained glass, painting the floor in fractured reds and blues. Shadows moved, 3, 4, maybe more, spilling from their horses and fanning out. A boot scuffed near the bell tower. A man muttered, close enough to smell the sour in his breath. Elias raised the revolver and waited. "Vance," the first voice called, closer now. "You always were a stubborn dog. Don't be foolish. Coin changes hands. That's what towns are built on." Elias's lip twitched. "This one's not coin." Another shot spat. Plaster stung his cheek. He fired back twice, heard a yelp and the thud of a body hitting wet earth. The chorus of hooves shifted. The other spread wider, looking for a blind corner. Wind tightened. A long, low moan that seemed to rise from the ground. Lightning forked outside, white and merciless, and for a heartbeat the nave flashed bright as noon. In that slice of light, Elias counted them. 6 men, maybe 7, rifles and short-barrel pistols, bandanas tied against the rain. 5 rounds, he whispered to himself. Make them sermons. Clara moved to the far aisle, keeping low, eyes tracking the shadows. "Tell me where," she said. "Hold the corner by the baptistry. If they rush, swing for the knee. They'll fall where they stand. Don't hesitate," she nodded, jaw set. "I won't." A fist hammered the side door. Hinges screamed. The barricade jumped. Elias aimed, waited for the silhouette to commit, then fired. The door boomed with the impact. A cry cut off fast. Silence fell for a thin, brittle second. Rain sizzled on torches. Somewhere the cracked bell knocked against its throat, metal to metal, a dead church trying to speak. Then the world surged. Boots pounded. The main doors jumped in their frame as shoulders hit wood. The barricade slid an inch across wet stone. From outside came the scrape of a crowbar, teeth biting into the gap between boards. A man laughed, high and eager. Elias drew a breath that tasted like dust and thunder. He glanced once at Clara. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were clear. The crowbar squealed. The beam lifted. The pews lurched forward. The church doors slammed open, the storm shoving through, and lightning threw the riders' shapes tall and black against the nave as they poured in with guns up and mouths set. By dawn, the storm had broken, leaving the prairie washed clean and gray beneath a pale sky. Mist hung low over the fields, and the air carried the smell of wet earth and wood smoke as Elias and Clara rode into town. The horse stumbled with exhaustion, its flanks foamed with sweat, but Elias pressed it on toward the square, where a clapboard building wore the crooked sign of law. Sheriff's office. Inside, the light was dim, a single lantern throwing shadows across the walls. Sheriff Cutter sat behind his desk, boots up, chewing tobacco with the slow rhythm of a man who'd long since given up hurry. He was broader than Elias remembered, his beard grayer, his eyes narrower. He spat into a tin, the sound sharp in the silence, and studied them both. "Well now," Cutter drawled, leaning back in his chair. "Didn't expect to see you ride in, Elias, not after all these years." His gaze slid to Clara, lingered too long, then came back. "Storm must have pushed you desperate." Elias didn't waste words. "We need protection." The sheriff chuckled low, the sound rough with contempt. "Protection's a scarce thing, friend. Costs more than you can pay." Elias stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "You remember the border?" he said. "Remember when I dragged you out from under fire? You'd be bones in a shallow ditch if not for me." For a moment, Cutter's jaw tightened and the memory flickered in his eyes. Then it hardened. He leaned forward, spit dark into the tin. "I owe you, sure. But debts don't outweigh money. And money says the ranchers run this town. They paid for her fair or foul, and they'll want her back." Hand her over and I'll forget you ever rode in. Clara's voice cut the room like a blade. So justice has a price? Then name it. She took one step forward, her eyes fierce, unyielding. I'll pay in blood if I must. The sheriff shifted in his chair, just enough to betray that her fire unsettled him. He tried to cover it with a smirk, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Elias's hand hovered near his holster, the leather creaking as his thumb brushed the worn grip of his revolver. Cutter leaned back again, his smirk growing meaner, more certain. Don't get righteous on me, Elias. You want to fight the whole town? Be my guest. But you won't find the law on your side. Not anymore. He rose, slow and deliberate, his spurs scraping the floor. They're coming tonight, and I won't stop them. The tin spitkin rang as he kicked it over, brown liquid spreading across the warped boards. The sound echoed like a warning bell. Clara's hands clenched at her sides, and Elias felt the weight of the night pressing in before it had even begun. The lamps in the saloon threw a sickly yellow light over haze-thick air. Smoke curled from cheap cigars, mixing with the sour tang of spilled whiskey and the stink of sweat that clung to men too long at cards. Laughter rolled across the room, sharp and cruel, spilling from a corner table where the ranchers sat fat with confidence. Their boots were propped on chairs, their pockets heavy with coin earned from the same auction that had nearly stolen Clara's life. The double doors creaked open, and the room went still. Elias stepped in first, coat still damp from the morning rain, his hat shadowing eyes that never once strayed from the men at the poker table. Clara followed, her shoulders squared, chin high, the bruises on her wrists catching the lamplight like iron cuffs not yet worn away. Every head turned, conversation dying in throats. Even the piano player faltered, a sour note hanging in the smoke before silence claimed the keys. The ranchers smiled at first, easy and mocking. One lifted his glass. Well now, thought you'd be halfway to the border by now, Vance. Brave of you to bring her back here. Elias didn't answer. He walked straight to their table, boots heavy on the wooden floor, and drew from his coat a folded sheet of paper. He laid it flat on the green felt between the scattered chips and half-spilled whiskey. The men looked down at it, frowns pulling their faces taut. It was the auction contract, edges still damp from the storm, ink blurred but legible. At the bottom sat a name bold and black, name of a man 6 months dead, buried in a churchyard 3 towns over. Elias's voice came calm, flat, carrying through the room. This is your auction. Signed by a corpse. Every word here's fraud. The ranchers froze. Cards hung in their hands. For a breath, the only sound was the drip of whiskey from an overturned glass pattering into the sawdust floor. Then one man leaned forward, his face dark. You don't understand who owns this town. Elias's eyes flicked to him, steel meeting flesh. I don't need to, but the truth does. A murmur swept the saloon. The barmaid edged closer, her eyes darting between the contract and the men who held sway over her wages. A miner near the wall spat into the sawdust, muttering about thieves. For the first time, the rancher's laughter didn't echo. Clara stepped forward then, her presence filling the space like thunder before rain. She set her palms flat on the table, leaning close enough for each man to see the fire in her eyes. You tried to sell me like a mule, but now every witness in this room knows the truth. Her voice was low but carried weight, the kind that settled into bone. She turned her gaze, slow and deliberate, meeting the eyes of the onlookers one by one. Remember this night? Remember who profits from lies? A silence pressed in, heavy and uncertain. Men shifted in their seats. The ranchers sat stiff, sweat beginning to sheen at their temples. Then came the sound, small, sharp, unmistakable. A click, metallic, deliberate. Under the table, hidden by cards and shadows, a hammer drew back into place. The smile returned to one man's face, thin as a blade. Elias's hand hovered near his holster. Clara's eyes narrowed, her body still as stone. Around them, the saloon held its breath. Someone was about to shoot. Clara reined in her horse first. She had traded the ragged dress for sturdy clothes, boots worn but her own. The rope burns on her wrists, now fading scars. She sat tall, her chin high, no longer a woman bound by rope or ridicule. Her story had begun to spread, whispered in towns like scripture passed hand to hand. The woman they tried to sell for being too big, who stood unbroken, who fought back, who turned shame into strength. Some called her a fighter, others a symbol, and all remembered her name. Elias sat across the dust of the fork, hat low, his coat patched at the sleeve where blood once stained. He carried himself with the weight of a man who had seen debts finally balanced, even if it cost him another piece of himself. He did not speak. Words were thin things beside what they had endured. Instead, he raised his head just enough for the brim of his hat to lift, eyes catching hers for the last time. Then he tipped the hat, slow, deliberate, a gesture older than vows. Clara's hand tightened on the reins. She breathed in the endless horizon, the road waiting. At the ridge she would pause, she knew, just once, but not to doubt, only to remember. Freedom was not a gift. It was the taking, the holding, the keeping, and she had taken hers. She turned her horse north. He nudged his west. The sound of hooves drifted apart, steady and sure, fading into the quiet of the morning. The prairie held them both for a moment longer, then let them go. The sky stretched wide, unbroken, the kind of blue that swallowed stories whole but never erased them. Somewhere out there, a fire smoldered in memory, and with it a truth that would not be forgotten. Justice once taken could never be sold again.